The tragic rise of Miriam Solititis, the woman who deceived and destroyed lives. What if I told you that one of the most notorious figures in history wore the guise of a saint, a woman who, behind a mask of purity, would commit horrific acts that would shock the world? This is not a fictional story, but a very real account of the woman who became known as the non-serial killer, wreaking havoc through deceit, power, and violence. Her name, Miriam Solititis. Born in 1883 in Greece, Miriam's childhood was far from privileged. Raised in an impoverished family, she had little opportunity for a bright future. Working on the family farm, her daily life was filled with hardship, struggling to get by. Some accounts suggest that Miriam also worked in a factory to help her family survive, a grueling job that added little hope to her bleak reality. But despite these early struggles, Miriam harbored aspirations of wealth and power, desires that would eventually lead her down a dark and deadly path. At the age of 23, Miriam made a choice that would shape her future. Seeking an escape from her harsh life, she decided to become a nun, joining the old Calandris church. However, her path was never one of true faith. Miriam's goal was always power, and through cunning and manipulation, she saw the church as a means to achieve it. As fate would have it, when the head monk of the old Calandris church, Matthew Carpathakis, grew disillusioned with the organization's teachings, he left to start his own movement. Miriam followed him, and together they founded the new Calandris church. Under her new name, Miriam Solititis, she became a prominent figure in this new sect. Little did anyone know, the woman who now held the title of Mother Miriam would soon exploit her position, leading to one of the darkest chapters in religious history. As the new Calandris church gained followers, Miriam quickly climbed through the ranks, becoming an influential confidant to Archbishop Matthew. When Matthew became embroiled in a conflict with the old Calandris church, Miriam stood by his side, helping him establish the Calandris Monastery, or the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines, in 1927. What was portrayed as a religious sanctuary was, in fact, a strategic move for Miriam and Matthew to gather wealth. You see, while the monastery was initially said to be a place of healing and spiritual refuge, the truth was far more sinister. Miriam helped secure land and resources for the monastery, but the methods by which this wealth was obtained were questionable at best. Greek author Nila Koulitakis, after reviewing the records, found no legal explanation for how Miriam and Matthew had come into such substantial property and funds. The monastery's official unveiling was marked as an homage to the Virgin Mary, but in reality, it served a darker purpose, fundraising for their movement and its true objectives. The monastery, located at a high altitude, was promoted as a tuberculosis healing center. Back then, TB was a leading cause of death, and, well, many who could not afford medical care turned to the monastery in search of a miracle. However, what awaited them was not healing, but exploitation. Miriam welcomed them, but without any medical resources, she forced them to live in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Doctors were kept out, unless they were called to sign death certificates. Miriam continued to hide the truth of her actions from the world, even as more and more patients died under her negligent care. As Archbishop Matthew aged and his health declined, Miriam seized control of the monastery. By 1939, she was firmly in charge. Matthew, once the driving force behind the monastery, had become a shadow of himself. His health deteriorated to the point where he relied completely on Miriam's leadership. Despite his attempts to retreat into spiritual isolation, Miriam began to assert herself as the true authority. Her ambition reached its peak when she was officially given the title of abbess of the Monastery of the Virgin in the Pines, a position of immense power. She wore the ceremonial black veil of high-ranking Eastern Orthodox nuns, symbolizing her authority. From that moment on, Miriam's ruthless quest for wealth took a darker turn. She exploited her position for personal gain, and, well, it was here that her crimes became truly horrific. She coerced donations under the threat of spiritual damnation. Those who refused were subjected to extreme forms of torture. Families, once drawn to her with hope, found themselves trapped in her twisted game, forced to comply with her demands or face deadly consequences. She would lock people away, allowing them to starve or die from neglect. Miriam's thirst for power had led her to commit dozens of murders, each one a part of her plan to expand her control and wealth. Miriam's crimes remained hidden for years, and it wasn't until her arrest that the full extent of her actions came to light. The media, shocked by the truth, dubbed her Mother Rasputin, a name that reflected the terror she had instilled in her followers. Her crimes were no longer rumors, they were documented and undeniable. Miriam's legacy was forever tainted by the bloodshed she caused. Estimates of the number of victims vary, but the Greek police confirmed that Miriam was responsible for at least 27 murders. Among the victims were devoted followers of the Calandris Church, including the Becca family, who had trusted her completely. Mrs. Becca, a devout follower of the church, was initially guided by her theological mentor to study under the guidance of Miriam Solititis. Little did she know the woman she admired would lead her into a web of horror. After pledging her entire estate to the monastery, Mrs. Becca soon discovered the horrific truth. Miriam, the so-called abbess, was using violence to maintain control over those who could help her thrive. When Mrs. Becca tried to escape with her 2 children, Miriam couldn't allow such a valuable asset to slip away. She locked Mrs. Becca in a dark, isolated cell, the very same cell where tuberculosis patients had died. But Mrs. Becca wasn't the only victim. Mr. and Mrs. Panna Paulio were also lured into Miriam's grasp with the false promise of salvation. Instead of spiritual enlightenment, they were held captive, starved, and forced to sign over their property to Miriam. Desperate to eliminate any loose ends, Miriam decided that their fates must end in death, and she took steps to ensure they never left the monastery alive. While the church initially denied Miriam's involvement in the deaths, the truth began to emerge. Witnesses testified that Miriam would lure innocent people to the monastery under the pretense of offering salvation. Once there, they would be imprisoned and forced to transfer their properties into Miriam's name. Miriam's crimes were not limited to property theft and abuse. Authorities eventually discovered that she had been involved in a network of illegal activities, including the illicit importation of olive oil and other goods. The authorities began to piece together the puzzle after receiving an anonymous tip. The tip came from the daughter of an elderly woman who had donated her entire estate to the monastery. The daughter believed that her mother had been coerced into the donation, and this accusation sparked an investigation into Miriam's financial dealings. The investigation revealed not only fraudulent activity, but also confirmed the involvement of the abbess in multiple violent crimes. One of the most chilling cases involved the disappearance of 18-year-old Simula Spirits. Her father, Christos Spirits, went to the police after learning that Miriam had convinced his daughter to donate $10,000 worth of property to the monastery. This case was just one of many that pointed to Miriam's systematic exploitation of the faithful, many of whom were manipulated into giving away their wealth under duress. As the investigation deepened, more victims came forward. The police discovered that Miriam had locked up her patients and followers in solitary confinement, subjecting them to cruel conditions that led to numerous deaths. It was revealed that almost 150 people died in the monastery due to the lack of medical treatment, starvation, and neglect, all under Miriam's watch. The full extent of Miriam's criminal empire came to light in December 1950, when a police operation was launched to search the monastery. A total of 85 officers along with a deputy prosecutor, judge, and coroner raided the grounds. They discovered 36 children, several elderly women, and many other victims, all malnourished, sick, and locked away in basements. The police rescue operation lasted through the night, and the harrowing scene that unfolded showed just how far Miriam had gone to maintain control over her victims. Despite her actions, Miriam continued to portray herself as a pious figure, even during her trial. She was initially charged with illegal imports, but as the evidence mounted, more serious charges were filed, including homicide, fraud, and torture. The investigation revealed that Miriam had amassed an enormous fortune, including hundreds of homes and farms, as well as gold and jewels, all obtained through manipulation and murder. Her trial was one of the most significant legal battles of the time, with prosecutors working tirelessly to bring her to justice. In 1951, the church's authority, which had once protected Miriam, was dismantled, leaving her exposed for the monster she truly was. The Matthewites, Miriam's followers, were no longer allowed to practice their beliefs, and the church's influence over her was gone. On December 4, 1950, Miriam Solititis was arrested, and the full weight of her crimes began to unravel. The investigation into her crimes continued, with authorities uncovering evidence of blackmail, forgery, and more murders. Miriam's reign of terror had finally come to an end, but the scars left on the lives of her victims would never heal. As Miriam Solititis stood in the courtroom, she rejected every charge brought against her, dismissing them as satanic fabrications. With a cold, detached demeanor, she maintained that all her actions were justified in the name of religion. In her mind, her twisted version of faith made everything she did permissible. no matter the cost. Some might say Miriam brought back a modern-day version of the Salem witch trials, where innocent lives were destroyed to further her own greed. Miriam's crimes were so vast that they led to 3 separate trials. The first trial took place between 1951 and 1952, the second continued into 1953, and the final trial concluded just months before her death. Her sentencing was staggering. Miriam faced a 26-month sentence after the first trial, 10 years after the second, and 4 more consecutive months after her final trial. Miriam spent her final days isolated in Avrov prison on Alexander's Avenue in Athens. Despite her grim surroundings, she did not endure the same fate as her victims. Her sentence lasted for 14 years, but she only spent about a year in prison before falling ill. She was transferred to a hospital where she passed away at the age of 71. During her time in power, Miriam had amassed over 400 followers. Nearly 500 people had given their property to the monastery, drafting wills in Miriam's name. But for all the property she acquired, the monastery was also a place where nearly as many lives were lost. Starvation, disease, and torture took the lives of around 500 people who suffered under Miriam's cruel rule. The true story of Miriam Solititis is a tragic one, a story where faith and manipulation collided in the most horrific way. Miriam's followers saw her as a divine figure, unable to fathom that their beloved abbess could be capable of such atrocities. However, the evidence and the brutality of her actions leave little room for doubt. Miriam's fanatical devotion drove her to extremes, and as psychologist Erich Fromm writes, greed is a bottomless pit that exhausts the person in an endless effort to satisfy the need without ever reaching satisfaction. Miriam's insatiable greed pushed her to commit whatever horrors were necessary to amass wealth and power. The lasting lesson of her life is that appearances can be deceiving. Miriam's black habit, once seen as a symbol of her spiritual dedication, was in truth the reflection of the darkness in her soul. In the end, her crimes were exposed, but not without leaving deep scars on the lives she destroyed. As we close the book on Miriam Solititis, we are reminded not to judge by appearance, especially when that appearance is the robe of a nun. Thank you for tuning in to Fusion Realities. That was the story of Miriam Solititis. Don't forget to watch one of our other videos on your screen for more true crime cases.